Presentation is now enabled.
10. So we'll start the session for this morning. Good morning, my name's Bim Panda and I'm one of the commercial fraud managers here at Lloyds Bank. I've been able to run this expert talk for ISBL today through one of our dedicated relationship managers, Phil Harriott, along with his team of other relationship managers across the education sector, continue to support our clients as well as others across the sector in providing proactive support. And today's example of fraud guidance is just one example of how we can provide that support to you. So for the next minutes or so, I'm going to be talking you through some fraud guidance, talk you through some examples of how we're seeing fraud being committed against our customers as well as others across the education sector. I'll give you real-life examples of how those frauds can play out, as well as providing you with some advice and guidance on how you can take steps to try and prevent fraud from occurring within your organisation. Now, how does the fraud attack actually start, and why are organisations vulnerable to fraud? And one of the key things is that attack comes down to us, humans and individuals and people. The human factor is often actually the weakest link in an organisation's security. So lots of money can be spent on providing state-of-the-art technology, but without having education and awareness for our people, we're missing one of the key links in providing that level of fraud prevention and our defences. Now, fraud and uncertainty and the change of working environments and practices because of COVID-19 have presented the fraudsters with an ideal opportunity to commit fraud by using COVID-19 as their hook. Now, we start of a large-scale fraud or cyber attack. It often starts off with some kind of phishing email, which I expect that lots of you have had some experience of, whether that be at work or at home. This is a recent phishing scam, just one example of the many where fraudsters are using COVID-19 as their hook, trying to trick people into clicking a link or opening up an attachment, which is the key thing that they're trying to do within a phishing email. Actually, on the face of this email, it actually looks as though it could genuinely have come from the government. You can see they've used some of their branding there. They've used the UK Notify display name, despite that actually the email address behind that is very, very different. And if you read what's displayed on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see that they're promising a tax refund, and all you need to do is click on that link now to access your funds. And when you click, you'll be then taken to a screen as displayed on the right-hand side. That's where the fraudsters then prompt you to complete some information which is confidential that they can then use for their own personal gain. So the key thing on these links or opening up attachments from emails, unless you're absolutely sure that you can trust who this email has come from. Often, email sounds a bit too good to be true. It usually is. That should give you that alarm bell and those warning signs not to go ahead and click on that link. So if you are then prompted to something where it's asking you for an awful lot of confidential information, again, that should be ringing alarm bells and should warn you that actually something isn't quite right here. Things like this are sent out en masse by fraudsters to target lots of individuals and hopefully catch somebody out. But actually the ones that we're a little bit more concerned with when it comes to the education sector and others in our commercial banking sector is phishing. So a targeted attempt by the fraudsters to catch people out through one of these emails. But they spend a little bit more time on a spear phishing email. And I've called out key things to look out for. So, for example, the email address and the display name. What this here is doing is trying to trick customers of Lloyds Bank who use the back system. So they've used our branding, they've used some of our colours. You can see the display name there appears as Lloyds Bank, which is easy for the fraudsters to do. And the email on that is lloydsbankemail.com, which is a genuine email address for the bank and has since been closed down. But you can see things on the email, so a missing salutation. So fraudsters have spent a little bit more time in tailoring this email to try and catch people out. They still haven't got that granular detail of exactly who they're targeting, so they might miss out the salutation, or actually it might just be generic, dear sir, madam. Things like our logo and our branding. The important thing to look out for is that classic attachment or a link asking you to open that attachment or click on a link, and that's the point at which you're getting into dangerous territory. That's the point at which you're downloading malicious software onto your device. And the key is to think about, do you know that person? The name that you recognise? Is it your relationship manager? Does the sign-off for that email actually match the email address that the email has come from? So when you start detail, you can often spot that actually an email of this nature might not seem as genuine as it first seemed at first glance. Important bits like that. And as spear phishing, we've also seen a real uptick in text message scams. Now, NHS Test and Trace Service has again presented fraudsters with another opportunity to try and take advantage. Now, with text message scams, and the same concept here, just as phishing emails applies. Same way they can spoof the sender name, so just because it appears in your text message library to have come from Lloyds Bank, it sometimes hasn't. It could have come from a fraudster, and they could have just spoofed that name there. They've got requirement for urgent action, so in this example saying that you've got some unusual activity on your account, and they're taking you to a link or a website or a telephone number, and that link or that site or that telephone number will be in control of the fraudsters. So really, as much as having that awareness when it comes to phishing emails, you have that awareness that actually they can still do the same sort of thing, but actually just through a text message. Now, why are we about phishing text message scams of this nature? What happens if you actually click on the link or open up that attachment? What's the damage that we could be causing? What we're doing by opening up those attachments or clicking on those links is inviting malicious software, malware, onto our device. And when that malware sits on your device, so your laptop or computer, it'll enable the fraudsters to carry out a whole host of different things which are listed on the screen here. Now, some of the use of remote access tools to further control and infect other machines that are connected to your network. So one person within your organisation actually needs to click on that link or open up the attachment, invite malicious software onto their device, and that fraudsters then have the capacity and the ability to be able to infect other devices. So if you think of training should be aimed at, it's pretty much everybody within our organisation. Anyone that email, which right across the board. What they do is capture screenshots of anything that you're looking at on your screen. They can encourage pop-ups to try and capture further confidential information. Now, key telltale signs that you've got some malware on your device is slow running. So if all of a sudden your computer starts to react really slowly, you should get it checked out by your IT team. Or lots of pop-ups appear, so pop-up windows, and they're prompting you for confidential information, or you just can't shut them down. Again, if that starts to appear, that's another telltale sign that something's not quite right, and that's the point at which you seek further advice. So that's why we need phishing emails and text scams, as I say, and that isn't just the only part of this initial phase that the fraudsters go through before they get ready to launch an attack into your organisation. One of the key things that features into their research and reconnaissance phase is also looking at things like your digital profile. So looking at your footprint across digital channels, across the internet, across social media platforms. And, often things like LinkedIn are a good starting place for the fraudsters because it gives them information of who you're in the capacity of your organisation or your school, who are your options, who are perhaps some of your colleagues, and they use that information then to do a more targeted attack, and something that we call social engineering, which is the sophisticated trying to trick people into giving away confidential information by putting them into a scenario where they're talking to you and they can relate to you and using lots of snippets of information that they've gathered about you to make that conversation seem more genuine and plausible. So use information about some of your connections. They might report to one of those connections. They might be looking at other social activity across other platforms and identifying an opportunity to launch an attack. Lots of examples where fraudsters use things like Facebook to identify someone's personal profile. And when, in normal times, when we're not in lockdown, they would identify a time where they knew that they were out of the office, perhaps checking in to a holiday resort, and that they were then away from the office, and would use that as an opportunity then to launch an attack into the organisation whilst this individual was away. There's a lot to gather from digital profiles and social media platforms. So really do think about what information you're sharing across those platforms. What profiles say about you? Is it for someone to connect the dots from your professional profile on things like LinkedIn to your personal profile? Do you reach with individuals that you genuinely know and trust? And by doing that, limiting how much information could potentially get into the wrong hands. So it's worth a clean up through your social media profiles and just seeing what information is out there about you and how you fit into your organisation. Now, once you've gone through a period of research and reconnaissance and perhaps had a look at things like your digital footprint, had a look at targeting you by some sort of phishing or phishing email, they then get ready to actually launch their attack into the organisation. And a number of different forms, and looking at some of the figures from last year that we recorded here at Lloyds Bank, we can see that actually the majority, you see that massive wedge in this pie chart, is invoice fraud. So, the two leading attack methods are CEO fraud and invoice fraud. And I'll give you some examples of how this can play out, but it just goes to show actually that, these types of fraud, CEO and invoice fraud, have been around for such a long time, and many of you will have already had some training around this sort of fraud, but just continue to evolve and change the ways in which they launch these sorts of attacks. They become more and more savvy, and see from those figures there that actually we're still seeing a large majority of our customers are being targeted by this sort of fraud. Now, within the top 4 types of fraud attacks is Vishing. So Vishing is voice phishing. So just on that theme of phishing and tech scams, we can, the other examples is that fraudsters use Vishing, so voice phishing. Now, sectors, not just education, but one of the key objectives for the fraudsters when they're launching these sorts of attacks is to trick people into ultimately going ahead and processing a payment that will benefit the fraudsters. And they do that in a number of different ways. So some of that be to get you to release your card and reader code or your passwords, which will enable them to then authenticate the payment on your behalf. They might do the legwork, but might give a story to convince you into moving funds into what they'll call a safe account. And one of these more recently, a large number of Microsoft scams over the last couple of years, where fraudsters took you through a scenario where they try and get access to your computer remotely. More and more, important now that many of us all work remotely, where the others will call you, purport to be from perhaps your IT team or organisation that you use, like Microsoft, that there's a problem or issue with your device and they need to remote in, gain access to your device so that they can carry out this so-called fix. So if you've had a call from IT and they remote into your computer, you click on a button to allow them to have access and they kind of take over. Well, it's exactly the same thing, but the fraudsters are using that legitimate technology to get access to your device for fraudulent gain. So, for example, the Microsoft scam that was covered across the press, we had many examples where the fraudsters would purport to be from Microsoft, gain access into someone's device, and then right at the end of the call, they would say that they need to log on to their internet banking to test that things are working now that it all should be sorted, and if they can process a small fee to cover the cost of the call. And of course, users will then forget that the fraudsters have still got access to their device, and the fraudsters are actually able to capture all of the details, such as when you're logging in and when you're starting to process that payment. in other calls, we see the fraudsters will purport to be from the bank or the bank's fraud team. You and say that perhaps there's been some fraudulent activity on your account, and in order to recall some of those payments or in order to help you with those payments, they need you to release your card and reader code or your passwords. And the point at which alarm bell should start ringing, because the bank would ask you to reveal things like your card and reader code or your password. And it's in mind any of your staff who work with the finance team and have things like the payment system of that fact that the bank would never ask you to reveal things like your full card and reader code or your passwords. Now, in the way in which they launch these sorts of Vishing calls, they're very savvy in terms of being able to spoof the telephone number. So if you were on one of these calls and you said, well, how can I actually ensure that you're genuinely the bank? Something here doesn't quite feel right. How can I double check? They say, well, if you have a look at the number that's appearing on your caller display on your phone and go onto the Lloyds Bank website, you can see that actually the number matches the one on our website. Lots of people just aren't aware that the fraudsters are able to spoof that telephone number. So just to be genuine on your screen, actually that could be any number that's calling you. They just use technology to be able to spoof the telephone number that appears on your caller display. And in fact, that's one way that they can catch an awful lot of people out. So it's important that you raise awareness amongst all of your colleagues that the fraudsters have the capacity to be able to do that. Those larger sections of that pie chart in video fraud, and these are two types of frauds that we see more and more now are penetrated by using email. So using emails as their way of compromising a system. So video fraud is where the fraudsters impersonate or hack into a business owner or a senior executive's email account. So that might be head teacher, it might be a business manager, it might be the head of finance within your school, someone more senior usually. Or it might actually impersonate one of your suppliers externally and direct a payment that you were due to pay to a supplier by use of a compromise of an email system. For examples where there's been some kind of email interception within your supply chain, so that actually they haven't targeted you as an organisation initially, they've targeted someone else within your supply chain. Actually, your correspondence with that company has actually meant that either you or they have fallen victim to fraud. So I'm going to do an example, a real case of email compromise to really just highlight how this could work. Now, I appreciate that despite in recent times schools closing their doors to many students, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Bills need to be paid, suppliers need to be paid, and exactly what happened with this school in particular a couple of months ago. So the 15th, they received an email from their supplier advising them of a new phone number, and I'm going to call this school XYZ School for the purposes of today. So School received an email from one of their key suppliers saying that they've got a new phone number because of more remote working. They've had to change where people are working from. Many more people are working from home. As a result of that, they've had a change of phone number. So would you mind just updating your systems? Forwarded on to another colleague internally to update the central database where all of the supplier contact details were held. Didn't have it, and everyone kind of continued to carry on with their tasks. So 20th April, an electronic invoice, so by email as an attachment, PDF, received as expected from this supplier the amount of £59,000. Now, different when they received this email was this email with this invoice attached was that there was a new account number quoted. That they were doing what should as per their process, and what they then did when they got round to making the payments on the 22nd, they made a call out to the supplier to check the account details, and that was a part of their process. They shouldn't be changing or updating account details and making a payment without double checking and making a phone call first. That's exactly what they did. So they called it was held on their database, and of course they confirmed that the new account number was correct, and it was due to some internal accounting and restructuring. The invoice and the payment of $59,000 was submitted as part of a whole host of different back payments. Now, a few the school received another email containing another electronic invoice from this company, and we'll call them Y Limited for the purposes of today, for $59,000. This is the point at which we thought, well, that's strange because we've already paid, the invoice that we were expecting for $59,000. So why have we got another one that's come through? That's, of course, the point at which they realise and quickly establish that Y Limited hadn't really sent the original invoice, and it transpired actually that when they started to investigate this, that Y Limited had had their IT systems hacked, and the fraudsters had managed to gain access to that system and were to carry out this fraud. So it's only when they received this additional email with this new attachment that they realised that something had gone wrong. So the fraudsters do it. So as I say, it turned out that Y Limited had had their IT systems hacked, and what the fraudsters had been able to do was actually get into their systems and watch what they were doing in regards to their invoice process, in regards to emails. So they've been watching that correspondence between them and their clients. They create genuine-looking emails as part of this process, genuine-looking emails, and as well as genuine-looking PDF invoice attachments. Now, paper that had kind of come on that PDF attachment containing that change of contact details was something that the fraudsters had quite easily mocked up based on getting hold of the company logo, tweet a few things, and then sending that through. And that's, of course, a key part of the fraud here. What the fraudsters had done was mocked up the email to say that their contact details were changing, recognising that the school had in their process to double-check any kind of account detail changes. So then if they preempted that a few weeks before actually sending in the attempt to pay an invoice to a new account, they could catch the school out, because when they call back to double check those details, they would be calling back to a number that was controlled by the fraudsters. From the school's perspective, the letter had come in and looked to be genuinely from their supplier organisation, from Y Limited, and for someone to receive that sort of email that comes through as a letterhead, you wouldn't question it. It wouldn't be considered as suspicious. And many of you can appreciate that you might be caught out or could double think something that they mean in similar circumstances. Was right by calling through and verifying the details, of course, for the request to change to the new account. But actually, one of the key parts of their process should have also been to verify those details when it came in for that original request to change the telephone number. Now, of course, within that and the payment details, of course, went to an account that was controlled by the fraudster. But the actually that research and reconnaissance phase to really look into perhaps their Y Limited, their email systems, the way that they correspond with their suppliers and customers. They looked into perhaps the school and their processes to identify that they should have a process where they double-checked by calling, and they emptied all of that by then ensuring initial request to change and update the phone number. So lots into this from a fraudster's perspective, trying to ensure that they can hopefully, from a perspective, catch people out and gain fraud. What the cost of a fraud attack is to an organisation like a school or to other victim organisations, we can see from this equation here that there's lots of factors to bear in mind. So there's the amount that was stolen, and in the example here it was $59,000. They did report it quickly to the bank, and we made some recovery for them, but unfortunately it wasn't quickly enough. There was that level of time that passed between discovering that they'd received that duplicate invoice, and unfortunately time gives the fraudsters time to be able to transfer the funds across a whole host of different accounts to try and get them in those funds into their hands. Cost of fraud, yes, it is that amount that's stolen, but there's also other implications in relation to reputation, the time it takes to investigate and the disruption that it can cause. Now, think about reporting. You've got to report it to the bank to try and see if you can get a hold of those funds and if there's any funds remaining, as well as that reporting it to the police if you've got some kind of insurance that you think might cover you in these sorts of circumstances, such as cyber insurance, which doesn't cover you for every type of fraud, but may cover you for certain types of cyber incidents. Again, reporting to that insurance firm will take time. And then, of course, reporting to organisations like the ESA. Got some kind of funding shortfall as a result, because I imagine for many of you, if 59,000 come out of your cash flow today, that would call and, make you question really in terms of other payments that you've got to pay and have knock-on implications of that. When you start to put some of the other factors together, not overlooking the impact that it can have on staff. So if you think about that whole process, there was a couple of individuals within this school that felt that they were responsible for making this payment, and even more so now, given how we're all working remotely and perhaps, only going into the office one or two times a week, probably return to some kind of normality now, whereas a few months ago, where many people were just going into the office a couple of days a week or working remotely, of having that impact on you as an individual can have quite, damage effects. So important to bear in mind that cost of what it can cost you for your actual staff and their morale. The fraud actually can start to add up to much more than just that 59,000 that apparent in this case. Now, no email compromise that we've seen in the example that I just talked through, we're seeing lots of examples as well at the moment of internal email compromise. So where the fraudsters are compromising an email system of one of your colleagues internally. Now, this is just an example of a case that we looked into, and you can see there when you read that, it's coming from Derek, who is one of the more senior members of staff within this organisation, to Jane, an urgent payment that needs to be processed. It slipped through the cracks because someone else is on furlough. I've told ABC that they'll have the money today, and I'm in meeting, so can you prioritise? Now, if you're Jane in this example, having received that email from someone quite senior, ask you to make an urgent payment, saying that you can't contact them for the rest of the day, and actually not being that familiar with the process of payments, you might be inclined to go ahead and make that payment. And that's what happened in this example. To remember that actually internally, if you're receiving emails of nature, remembering that the fraudsters do have the ability to hack into email accounts within your organisation. So it makes it even more difficult to spot an example like this, because the email looks to have come from Derek, but it actually has. It's come from Derek's inbox. It's come from Derek's mailbox. So the fraudsters have gained access to Derek's mailbox and have been able to create this email. So they've probably, again, been watching the correspondence, watching the kind of language that Derek uses, seeing if they've got a process whereby, if they send an email requesting that someone else will just act on that email without making further checks. That's exactly what happened here. So again, it's really important that you raise awareness amongst your colleagues of how internal emails can be compromised and hacked, and on alert. And if you received an email of this nature, your boss, and they said that they were on a teleconference for the rest of the day, yourself what you would do in that situation. I would hope is pick up the phone to Derek anyway. He's on teleconference for the rest of the day, but you can try and call him now, or call through to someone else within the wider team, so someone else that perhaps has the same level of authority or similar authority to Derek, to double check. And ultimately, don't just rely on that email as that one form of communication to request a payment. Always check the details. And it's important, you use some of those things to try and stay one step ahead of email compromise. So having those clear procedures for all of your payments. If you have a process whereby someone can send you an email to request a payment, how do you ensure that you double check and verify? One of the best things to do is not have a process whereby someone can just email you and request a payment. Appreciate that that's pretty difficult now, seeing as lots of people are working remotely. But always a level of authentication within that process. So if someone does send you an email, how can you perhaps look to encrypt it? How can you double check the details? How can you use an alternative method of communication? And there's lots of options available to us. Technology has been a key enabler for us all to work effectively over the last few months. So picking up the phone, using things like Microsoft Teams or chat function, using perhaps, a WhatsApp network that you've got for some of your colleagues at work, using that extra level of authentication to try and double check and authenticate that structure. All down to using that different channel to communicate. Thinking, and I often get asked the question, well, how do fraudsters actually get hold of the funds? What accounts are they using? Well, one of the key things that they do is actually recruit money mules to process their proceeds of crime and their stolen funds. And we've seen examples where children as young as 13 have been recruited and used as money mules. So their accounts will either be bought off them, or they'll be told that they'll get paid a fee if they allow them to process a few transactions through their accounts. And it's so that, you ask yourself within your school and within your organisation, are your students aware of the risks? That are spending a lot of time on their phone, have got a network of friends that are outside of the school. Are tell signs that potentially that they need to be made aware of the risks associated with things like money mules. Now, XYZ have produced a number of resources that will enable you to provide some of these key bits of information as part of lesson plans. So lots of great insights that are available on their websites. If you search or just click on that link, that's something that I can say afterwards. So xyz.org.uk, if you go through their insight section, you can see there that there's some anti-fraud lesson plans. Some great information and resources that are available there for you to use. Things that we're seeing on the increase and on the rise, and it really is a matter of when this happens to you, not if, is ransomware. Some of you might have heard of ransomware already. You might have come across it a couple of years ago when the NHS got caught out by ransomware. More recently, earlier this year, we had Travelex that were caught out by ransomware. Essentially, what it is that will be on your computer, and on your computer screen, you would be presented with a screen very similar to this, where your files have been encrypted, and in order to regain access to those files, you need to pay a ransom. Instructions on this screen from the fraudsters to tell you how to pay this ransom. But really important that, if this happened to you, or happened to colleagues, or perhaps whilst they were working remotely, how would you respond? What would be the first thing that you would do? And you've got a plan. It really is a matter of when it happens to you and not if, as I say. We're seeing so many more cases of ransomware. It's really important that you talk to your wider team around what your response is to something like ransomware. Now, having is vital. Is to bear in mind that there's no guarantee that if you do pay the ransom that you'll get your files back. It's definitely during and discussing with your management and having an approved approach. What should you do if you are working from home and a ransomware attack appear on your screen there? What advice? It's essentially part of the defense is to back up your files regularly to an independent source. Now, that might happen automatically within your organisation, but it's important to ask the question as to how often and how that happens, and also asking the question of how you're able to actually regain access to a file that's been backed up. One of your defences is updating and patching your software. So that is, if you're an iPhone user and get that message that appears on your screen telling you that there's a new operating system and you need to update your phone, it's exactly the same concept applies for your computer and the software that you use on that computer. That software needs to be patched and updated promptly because the new releases of those patches are there to protect you against some potential flaws in the security of that application. So it's really important that you patch that software really quickly so that you're able to best defend yourself against any vulnerabilities. Virus software, firewalls in place, and some malware protection. All of those things are defences against ransomware. Have your plan, as I said, to have that plan that you've agreed with your management that you're aware of, and also ask some of your key stakeholders. If you think about, that example that I mentioned at the start of the year, Travelex were caught out by ransomware. Now, if you think about all of the organisations that are reliant on Travelex as their service provider, that, of course, then had a knock-on effect on them too. So if you're the key organisations that you work with, you want to know what their response would be to ransomware, how quickly they think they could get back on their feet. That's really important is that if you do find that you're infected with some kind of malicious software like ransomware, you have some forensic cleansing post-incident before you start to try and restore from backups, because the last thing you'd want to do is invite some of that horrible software, malicious software, back onto your devices if you're restoring from a backup. Now, one of these is really important, whilst we all work differently in the current circumstances, is the threat of insider fraud. Everything that I've covered so far is that threat of fraud coming from, the external environment. We often sometimes forget that actually sometimes that threat can occur internally within our own organisations. Now, we've seen examples of this recently, and one example that I'll call out is that there was an individual that would normally have to supplier payments, but was at furloughed. So staff, finance director in this example, was covering all of the administration and payments. Now, they had a scheduled payment that was to be made to a carrier company, and actually chased up the payment. This finance had a look into the payment, had a look into previous payments that they'd made, and then started to realise that actually something was wrong, something wasn't quite right. So investigating that, he identified that there was a number of other monthly payments to a different company which seemed really suspicious, and upon checking, that company said that they actually hadn't received any payments from this organisation since 2018. So this member of staff that was now on furlough had been trusted with payments for about 10 years, but was actually raising false invoices and doctoring emails for his own personal gain. This manager within finance says that perhaps he should have restricted the way in which you can change bank account details on the internal system. But, this individual had the authority to be able to process payments on the online banking system, but they just couldn't sign off direct debits and arrangements like that. But there's still a number of ways that the fraud could have been committed by this individual, because after all, the individual had 10 years of experience of knowing how the business works, what their processes are like, and all the ways in which they can find their way around it. Aware of that threat, and really asking yourself, who looks after the payments within your organisation, and is there any room potentially for them to be able to use some of that authority and that responsibility for their own personal gain. Now, there's a lot to do to protect your school from that threat, external threat. And, some of those are listed on screen there, but thinking about the current circumstances and asking the question about if you've got enough users that are enabled on the online banking system, to become sick, how do you ensure that the right people with the level of authority would be able to deal with payments? Do your approvers understand their responsibilities to actually check payment details before they go ahead and approve a payment? If he's going into the system and checking that it's fully in line with what they think and going ahead and approving it, that's not quite right. they need to deeper into that process and really understand their responsibilities. Things like station always give you that added level of approval and security, because there's always kind of two or even more advisors that are looking over a payment before it's approved. It's important, whilst we all continue to work a little bit differently and have things like long-term working from home arrangements in place, no doubt place an increased trust on colleagues within their own personal space. And sometimes that absence of office etiquette and discipline might use the opportunity for internal fraud. So you have continued engagement with your team members, and any existing monitoring and oversight arrangements aren't compromised as a result of us now working differently. Now, awareness around fraud and cyber threats and educating our people, we all need to have a look at protecting our technology. And there's lots of simple steps that we can all take responsibility to, so that we can manage the basics really well when it comes to protecting our technology. There are things that we can all do, and there's lots of people that think this is the point at which I feel a little bit guilty because I know that perhaps my passwords aren't as secure as they could be. Privacy is so important, and if we think about how many things are password enabled now and how many times people just default to a really simple and easy to guess password because it's easy to remember, that's to an awful lot of fraud, unfortunately. And your password security that you're using for lots of new virtual apps that you might be using in recent times, such as Zoom and House Party, that level of security by having that strong, robust password is giving you that extra level of protection for using those systems and applications. So the advice from the National Cybersecurity Centre is to have a strong, robust password, which is 3 completely random words, will give you a strong, robust password, and you can use number symbols to create that strong, robust password. But 3 are completely random and only known to you, so not things that are easy to guess, such as your pets' names or your children or your partner and their dates of birth. Those things are easy to guess with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of ability by the fraudsters. But 3 random words might be, anybody else, but actually might mean something to you. And in one of our recent webcasts, we did a bit of a workshop and worked through an example of how you can build this strong, robust password. So that's something that you can revisit and watch if you visit our webpage. That strong, robust password, some of the other things to think about are, where possible, using 2-factor authentication for things like your email in particular. So that's where when you sign up to an account and you enter in your password, it will also ask you for things like your mobile number. And what you're doing there is, next time you log on, as well as entering in a password, something that you know, it will also send you a text message to verify you logging in to something that you have on you, which is your phone. And by doing that second level of authentication to verify that it is actually you that's logging in, some will be able to guess your password and log in that way, but if they tried to do that, they wouldn't have your phone. So when you receive that code, that's the point at which you'd be able to identify that someone's potentially trying to get into your account. Other things, stay safe online. About keeping your devices safe. Whilst we all work differently, if you're using personal devices or if any of your staff are using personal devices to access things like online banking, are devices protected in the same way that your school devices might be? Having that prompt patch management, having that antivirus, having firewalls in place, and also files to regularly so that you can ensure that you're not being compromised. That you can use to check if your details have been compromised in a data breach is by using this website, haveibeenpawned.com, PWNED. If you go on that website and you enter in your email address, it will actually tell you how many times your email address has been compromised in a data breach. So there's lots of data breaches that you hear about in the press all of the time. And if you think about your details that are contained by that company that have been involved in a data breach, that will be things like your address, things like your password. So you have been involved, if you find that your data has been involved in a data breach and you perhaps use that same word on that website for another one, hopefully this will identify that you actually need to start making some progress to amend and change that password across sites where it's reused, really reusing passwords across different sites. Exercise to do just to see actually how many times your details have been caught in a compromise and in a data breach. So in terms of recommendations when it comes to fraud prevention, that you take a moment wherever you receive an email or a phone call where someone's trying to get you to action really quickly, rush in taking some kind of action or give away some information, ask yourself, is this individual really who they say they are? And that's whether it's on the phone or whether it's an email or a text message. How can you be sure that if someone calls and purports to be from the bank, how can you verify that it really is them? Ask yourself pause to check that it is them. And if in that case, you're on the phone and someone's purporting to be the bank and something doesn't feel quite right, phone and call back using a number that you know and trust, so someone like your relationship manager, and then go through your process there and start giving away information over the phone or now. Now, some of the, many of these that we've talked through already as we've run through the session today, but things like regular training and testing for all of your staff. So today's session has been recorded, and it's something that you can share across your school with other members of your team. It's really important that you remind all of your staff, so anyone in particular that uses the banking system, that the bank never asks them to reveal things like their full passwords, their memorable information, their login details, or the hard and reader authentication codes, which the fraudsters would need to process a payment on your behalf. And if it's gone wrong, it's really important that you notify the bank as soon as you can. Anything could potentially, something to do with fraud, and you've potentially paid away a payment to fraudsters. It's important you contact the bank immediately so that we can do everything that we can to try and stop some of those funds from getting into the hands of fraudsters. Put all of these components together when it comes to fraud prevention. I like to think of it as a kind of three strings to try and pull together to try and keep yourself safe when it comes to fraud. So thinking firstly about your technology, the steps that we've discussed in terms of keeping your software up to date, patching those pieces of software, using good levels of passwords, using that extra level of security to protect yourselves online. But as well as that, thinking about how you can keep some of your technology up to date, and how also you can ensure that you're staying safe whilst we all work differently and in different working environments. Continues to make progress in technology as well. So some of you might have heard of confirmation of pay recently being introduced. So many of the major banks have now signed up to it. But what PAYE means is that now when you make a payment online, it actually checks the sort code and account number details to the account name that's being paid, to the beneficiary account. So whereas historically, unfortunately, the banking system online was such that you could be paying to a sort code and account number that you thought was going to Vin Panda, if that account was in the name of Joe Bloggs instead, the payment will still get there based on the sort code and account number. Where actually now confirmation of pay will give you an alert if you set out to make a payment to Vin Panda, and actually when you entered in the details, it came up and said, actually, no, that account is in the name of Joe Bloggs. And make all of your team aware of that, but also sure that they do the right thing if they get that alert. So they shouldn't just dismiss that. That should be the point at which they and then go back and check the details. Internal processes, looking at what are your processes when it comes to payment, when we all work differently and how we have been in recent months. How are you working differently to ensure that you've still got that level of oversight, you're still double checking details, In the example that I used, having that process to not only double check and verify account detail changes, but also any contact detail changes for some of your suppliers. And remember, those are really savvy and they will use things like COVID-19 or a different hook to try and catch people off guard. And that's exactly what they did in that example. They just tried to take advantage of a process by using a story that someone could relate to, because everyone knows that things have been a bit different in recent months. That with our people, sort of awareness around some of these fraud threats, around how the fraudsters can be quite savvy in launching these attacks. Things like the phishing technology, things around how the fraudsters can hack into email systems. So actually, it's quite difficult to spot an email compromise. All of that down to awareness. And if we go back to the point that I made right at the start, often the human factor is that weakest factor of our organisation's security. But if one's aware of what to look out for, they're prepared to be able to spot a case of fraud when it does happen to them. And that's available if you are keen to learn more. We have a page on the Lloyds Bank website. We also work closely with organisations like the Global Cyber Alliance, and their website's listed there. The National Cyber Security Centre, who have released lots of good information in the current pandemic around how you can stay safe online, and other organisations like CyberAware. Action Police's reporting site. So, as I said, as much as it's important for you to report it to the bank as soon as you can, it's also important you report into police. And do that through their website, actionfraud.police.uk. We run a quarterly webcast for all of our clients, and it's something that you can sign up to. We have alerts that are shared on our channels across LinkedIn and Twitter. There's Lloyds Bank for Business page, or the Bank of Scotland for Business page. And on there you can see some of the current trends and information around how to stay safe online, as well as notifications for events like our webcast. Sources that are available there if you'd like to learn more. Now, I'm happy for questions if anybody has any. I will take some of the questions by using the chat function. So I'll give you that. And we're on the WebEx. If you can just click on the little speech bubble that should be at the bottom of your screen, and then at the chat function, and you then type in your question, and I'll receive it online. I'll give it a moment, just in case. And as I said, today has been recorded, and I'm sure that ISBL will be keen to share this recording with all of their members, so that you can replay it and share it with some of your colleagues. Online. So with that then, I'll draw the session to a close this morning. As it has been recorded, and the link will be circulated shortly after. So I do hope that you found today's session useful. And thank you for your time, and thank you for joining me this morning. Have a great day.